Hello, welcome back to another video lecture. Today we're going to talk about the aftermath of the Compromise of 1877 and what the post-Reconstruction South looked like. Kind of talk about the big question, was Reconstruction a success or failure, right? Okay, let's get started. So, the post-1877 South, just a quick review. If you remember, we have the Compromise of 1877 that established Rutherford B. Hayes as president, but also removed the military control from the South, which basically leaves us with the end of Reconstruction. Okay, so whatever we accomplished, to 1877, that's it. That's final. All right. Now, it's a word that's important to know. It's not going to be on the test or anything, but you might see it come up every once in a while. Is antebellum. Okay, antebellum, right, means before the war. And often if you're talking about American history, what this means is the Southern society before the Civil War, right? So the post-1877 South is often referred to as the New South, right? Because it looks a little different than it did antebellum. Okay, the New South is characterized mostly by more industrial influence. Okay, so the Southern economy is still primarily agrarian, right? It's mostly farmers, but it's going to move from 100% or not 100%, but mostly farm-based to industrial cities. Okay, so places like Atlanta, right? We're going to get more factories there, and that's mostly going to come from northern states and banks and financial influence there. So we start to see kind of power be concentrated in these financial institutions. Some Southerners, obviously those old Southern elites, those agrarian plantation owners, they're going to resent that a little bit. Okay, we also rebuilt the infrastructure of the South, so like roads and bridges and that kind of stuff, with property taxes. Now, that's important to understand because which group of people owned property, right? It's not the freedmen, it's not the poor Southern farmer, it is those former slave owners that owned property. So this is kind of a radical Reconstruction goal come to fruition here. It's a way of punishment, right? Like we're going to force them to pay more in taxes to build stuff for the good of the whole society. Now, obviously, that's going to anger a lot of those, former elites of the South, and that's going to feed into some of that backlash against the radical Republicans we talked about yesterday. All right. Now, we can't talk about, post-Reconstruction South without first talking about the freedmen. Before we get to what life was like after 1877, it's important to review some of the major improvements that freedmen saw during the Reconstruction age and some that continued on afterwards, right? Obviously, wages are a big one, okay? The Reconstruction governments of the South established widespread public education. They offered better access to healthcare and more religious freedom and opportunity. Right? It's the church that's going to serve as an important community aspect for freedmen in the South. All right? We see some freedmen become property owners and small farmers. Okay, and then we see an increase in political power for the freedmen as well. And it's, of course, important to mention what we have written over here, the 14th and 15th Amendments, right? Huge in terms of the long-term equality that we strive for in America, right? Okay, so this is all benefits of Reconstruction on the freedmen. All right, now, the post-1877 South is under the control of the Democrats. And once the Democrats, no longer under the control of the radicals with military reconstruction, take power, they're going to take some steps to limit the rights of the freedmen, right? To walk back some of these gains that were made before 1877. And one of those includes poll taxes and literacy tests. And we learned a word about this, these poll taxes and literacy tests, right? To try to take away political power. We learned a word about this in the last one. That's right. It's disenfranchisement. Wow, we went full Dora the Explorer there, didn't we? Okay, anyway, I know you're listening at home, and I know you were just like, disenfranchisement, okay? Don't try to pretend you didn't get it. Okay, anyway, so they're trying to disenfranchise, right? They're trying to take away this political power, okay, through poll taxes and literacy tests, all right? They also institute something called sharecropping. Sharecropping is when you don't own the land that you farm. You rent it. This happens a lot actually in Benton County today, right? People rent out their lands, and you pay a couple $100 an acre to harvest the crop on the land. And what happens when you're a tenant farmer in Benton County is you pay that money, and then whatever profits you make from the field, you get to keep as the farmer who farmed the field, right? You just pay out the use of the land. Well, sharecroppers don't pay cash. They pay in crops. So they end up paying in what would be the profit they have to pay to the landowner. Okay. Now, so in a normal cycle, you take out a loan to get the seed to plant, you plant it, you harvest it, you sell what you have harvested for profit. Well, in sharecropping, you don't get to sell what you harvested. So part of that goes to paying off your rent, right? Well, then you don't have enough to sell for a profit. And so you're trapped in debt. You're stuck there. You have to take out another loan for the next year. Right now, a lot of the sharecroppers were getting kind of gouged on prices to make this problem even worse. Moreover, there were laws that were passed that said if you owed in sharecropping, if you owed, rent, you couldn't leave the land. So you're stuck on the land. Okay. So a lot of these sharecroppers ended up being trapped in debt, right? Tied some of them to the land so they couldn't leave the South even if they wanted to, okay? And so you have this, at the beginning of Reconstruction, you have this whole 40 acres and a mule dream, and it ends up being, sharecropping instead. So you're still better off than you were, obviously, but when you were in slavery, but this dream of economic equality, they fall short during Reconstruction. And its abrupt end in 1877 means the radical Republicans can't get to the place where freedmen have equal economic opportunity. Instead, they're sharecroppers, right? Racism and violence is persisting in the South, another hurdle to this economic opportunity. And the things like lynching and the KKK's intimidation are all still very active, okay? These Southern legislatures also pass what we call Jim Crow laws. All right, these are laws that enforce segregation. They keep Black people and white people apart. Okay, so we have public education, but instead of an integrated public education, you have a Black school and a white school. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's right. I'm inside your head. And I know what you're thinking because you're listening really closely and you know what the 14th Amendment says, right? 14th Amendment says you can't have two different sets of laws. If you got public education, it's just public education. It can't be different, okay? So Jim Crow laws can't be legal, right? They are. How? I know that's your thought, okay? How are they legal, right? Well, they're legal because of the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. This happens in 1896. Right? And it upheld Jim Crow law using the separate but equal doctrine. They basically said that the 14th Amendment never intended to integrate the races, only that it intended to make sure that they were equal. And so they can be segregated and still have equality. Now, we know with our modern perspective that is not the intent of these laws. These laws are intended to keep Black people under white people, right? And that their quality of public services is not going to be nearly as high as they afford to the white citizens, okay? And it is a way to keep white supremacy in the South. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court in 1896, just like it did in the Dred Scott case in 1854, made a huge mistake, right? Now, it's not until 1954 in the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas case that this is going to be overruled, right? And now the disenfranchisement that we talked about, okay, it's not until the Voting Rights Act of 1865 that these types of this type of disenfranchisement is overturned, right? So what we're talking about here in the post-1877 world, right? We're talking about almost 100 years, right? 90 years before the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed, right? Nearly 90 years, 80 years or since Jim Crow, 1877 to 1954 in the Brown versus Board case, right? We're talking about a very long time where we have actual systemic racism. It's called de jure systemic racism, as in the law actually dictates that there are two societies, right? And this goes beyond the South, right? This is in the North as well. There are something called redlining where loans aren't approved to households of Black families. Certain neighborhoods, it is illegal to sell your home to a black family. And in a lot of cases, if you have these segregated neighborhoods, the local governing board will build a park in one neighborhood and, a sewage plant in the other, right? Or a factory in the other. They'll zone it for industry and they'll zone one for park. And obviously the land values of a house next to a park is gonna be a lot higher than a land value of a house next to a factory. And it's those white neighborhoods that get that land value increase. And it's the black neighborhoods whose land value stays low. And this happens, right, for decades. This is called systemic racism. And you're going to hear that word a lot in the modern day, systemic racism, right? And there's a reason you do. Okay, so the failure of the radical reconstructionists in 1877 to ensure full economic and political and social equality for black people ripples into the modern world, right? Where it's not until the 1860s that we see those de jure segregation practices overturned, okay? And the effects of that still linger in our modern era.